This event is a new experiment in what we're trying to do in the business school at the George Washington University. When you lead a business school, you realize very, very early on that if you're doing the work that you want to be doing, that you're training the business leaders of the future. If you're not doing that, then you should get out of the game, because economies are built on business principles and business ideals and businesses themselves, and we should be in the process and in the game and in the experience of training the young people that are going to transform our global economy and transform the businesses within them. Now, if you do that, you have to then think very deeply about what it is that you're doing as a brand of business leadership. Who are you teaching? Who are you training? Many business schools emphasize things like strategy, or they focus on training the CEOs of the future, or they focus on training the financial wizards of the next financial revolution and crash, perhaps. But here at the George Washington School of Business, we have a little bit of a different focus. We, of course, want to train business leaders for whatever it is they want to be, but we also want to train people to be deeply embedded in their civic communities, to be deeply embedded in civic life, to think about the intersection of business and society, and to actually really think about ways to use their business skills and acumen to build great organizations, but then to also go on and make an impact in society. We want to train people to build a better world. Now, how do we do that? In Washington, D.C., there's a wonderful opportunity for that, and we talk often at this university about being at the center of it all. 6 blocks from the White House, across the street from the IMF and the World Bank and the IFC, and on the very stage where Crossfire used to be filmed. It's a wonderful set on which to be witnesses to the world's history and future. But in order to do it, you have to do it through programmatic development. You have to actually think how to use those building blocks to train students in very specific ways. And so we've been playing with a lot of things that build on the legacy of the institution that I inherited. There are many people in this audience, actually, who have been doing this kind of work at the George Washington School of Business for decades. And I want to acknowledge all of them here and thank all of them for being a part of this process for so long and being passionate collaborators with me in this endeavor. But there are 2 new programs that I want to mention now that are really sort of the centerpiece of what tonight is about. The first is a program that really came to us because I was thinking very broadly about how we could contribute to the nation's capital. Now, when you think about contributing to the nation's capital, you also often think about the federal government, you think about things like the State Department and Congress and the Hill. But we wanted to go deeper. We wanted to actually think about civic life. How do we actually build a business school that contributes to building a better society within this city in a time when joblessness was in distress? And we built a program called Creative Leadership and Civic Life that contributed a lot, and most recently culminated in helping the city write its 5-year economic development plan. And part of that process was identifying leaders that were major contributors to civic life. Another program that has been really important and has, for me, been somewhat of a game changer, if you will, came from the very generous gift of a benefactor, a trustee, a mentor, and a friend named Linda Rabbit, who's actually here in the audience today. Linda, thank you for all of your generosity. But about 8 months ago, Linda came to me and said, if you really want to make a difference, how about this? How about the fact that despite the fact that the conversation has been on the radar screen of corporations for decades about the unequal representation of women on corporate boards, how about the fact that it has not moved from 15 to 16% in decades? What about that? Why is that? And is there anything we can do about it? And so we sat down and started to think about it and started to think about how to contribute to women in leadership, how to move the dial on this important topic. Now, we're about to launch that program. This event tonight is actually the soft launch of it. Our first cohort that is in partnership with the International Women's Forum, many of whom are in the audience tonight, is going to invite 15 people from an applicant pool of some of the most interesting people, women who are the most accomplished around the world in their fields, to really think about moving them to positions that they can be ready for being on corporate boards. So when I thought about bringing these two programs together, I thought, well, who is the perfect person that personifies women in leadership and a creative and expansive and exciting engagement with civic life? Now, a couple of months ago, I saw my first concert with Marin Alsop, and I was just taken. I was just enthralled. I couldn't get enough of it. It was an amazing experience. And I've been back to see a couple of more since then. She is just a tremendous force, and there are a lot of groupies and acolytes just like me, so I'm not special in that. In fact, my mom is sitting in the audience, and she's the groupie that introduced me to her. And so it's such a wonderful honor to have someone like this, someone who is so forward-thinking. In fact, she has the distinction of being the first woman conductor of a major symphony orchestra in the United States. She has had all kinds of accolades. She's the first conductor ever to have received a MacArthur Genius Award. She is the first of many in her field, and she travels the world spreading an incredible gospel about leadership, women in leadership, how to actually think differently about civic life, and then how to bring the arts to that equation. And so it's such a wonderful opportunity and gift that through Linda we can have somebody like this here, and through Maestro Marin Alsop's generosity with her time that we could invite her here today. So without further ado, I will introduce to you our guest, Maestro Marin Alsop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a nice speech there, but I'll ignore that. It's nice to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, ideas, even my hopes with you. Leadership is a topic that I think about frequently because what I do, conducting an orchestra, is really, it's kind of like leadership distilled. It's the manifestation of leadership because through gesture, I have to somehow convince 100 experts to do what I want. And that requires some kind of leadership, I think. And, you know, to me, of course, there are certain qualities that great leaders share. But the way and the manner and the style of leading can vary widely, especially with conductors. I was thinking in preparing for the talk tonight, I was thinking about how crazy conductors can look when they're leading. And so I put together, I hope it works, a montage for you of sort of different styles of leadership. So let's show that. I hope you enjoy this. All shapes and sizes, my little comments here. The wild and flailing leaders. Charismatic, this, my teacher, suave. Okay, Zen-like. Can you guys see it? Oh, I'm sorry. I know some of these. I'm sure you do too. It's interesting, though, isn't it? Because it's so obvious. You're out. And interesting about age, you know, if you can command respect at a young age, that's always an issue. So different. Sorry, I couldn't resist. And I'm sorry, that ends up being me. But so it's interesting, though, isn't it, to see those different styles. But why aren't there more women on the major podiums of the world? And this, of course, is a question that I'm often asked, and I'm happy to be in an environment where I can actually talk about the question itself, because often a journalist asks me, besides being banal, it has to be possibly the most imbecilic question I'm ever asked, which is, so what does it feel like to be a woman conductor? You know, this is in the 21st century that you could have the chutzpah to ask that question is ridiculous to me. I guess in any century. I mean, it's silly. I have no idea. I just feel like myself. I mean, I don't wake up and say, last week when I was a lizard, I felt differently. This is how it is. And, so I start to think about, well, why? And of course, then I'm trying to answer in a very politically correct manner these questions always. So tonight I'm not going to be politically correct at all. I hope that's okay. Oh, good. It's okay with a couple of people. And, I try to think of why I don't see more women in these leadership roles. And I think back to a story, Catherine Comey, who was a conductor a generation ahead of me, and she told me this story about her daughter. She used to take her to all of her concerts. She conducted in Grand Rapids. And then when her daughter was about 8 years old, a visiting orchestra came, and they went to the concert, and the maestro came out, and her daughter turned to her and said, "My God, it's a man." And that really hit a nerve for me. It's all about what we're accustomed to. It's sort of this I don't believe it's prejudice. I believe it's conditioning. And then I started thinking about my own experience in the world. When I watch the news now, I don't like when there are two women anchors. It makes me nervous. And when there are two men, I don't like that either. Now, I like it if it's a woman and a man, and preferably one person of color. This is what I'm used to. And this has evolved, of course, over the years. Or I think about a recent experience when I've travel a lot. I fly, and I always just look, into the cockpit as I want to make sure someone. And who named it that, by the way? And so I look in there, and the other day there were two women, with the notes and everything, and I thought, oh my God, I got to get off, And of course, it was the best flight I've ever had. It was really smooth, but I thought to myself, I was mentally slapping myself, because if I could think that, I mean, what about just the normal people that don't think about women in leadership roles every day? It's just a matter of trying to get conditioned. And so, I came to parenting very late in life. I have a 9-year-old son. And, the irony is not lost on me that women are wonderful at this leadership role. And parenting, I thought I knew a lot about leadership. Let me tell you, I didn't know anything about leadership until I became a parent, because you need to be an expert. Talk about creative leadership. To be a great parent, I mean, you have to have all the skill sets. You have to multitask. You have to set priorities. You have to set boundaries. You have to set expectations. You have to be encouraging, but not too encouraging. You have to, there's so many skills that you have to bring to bear. And for me, especially, I think probably something that transfers is this idea that you have to be willing not to be liked occasionally as well. And I find that that's a hard thing, and maybe that is part of being a woman in this role. My son, when he was 5 years old, I was pushing him on the swing, and he said, Mama, and of course he's a genius. All children, I've noticed now, also are born geniuses, and we just gradually suck that out of them. But my son said, Mama, so when do they make you a citizen and give you money? And I said, well, Auden is his name. Well, I have good news and bad news on this front, and you're a citizen. And I said, but money is something you're going to have to earn, and this is why you have to choose a job that you're passionate about and never feels like work. And for me, that job is music. I didn't grow up with a lot of the advantages that would typically define privilege. But I think I grew up with the greatest advantage of all. I grew up in a household that exuded possibility, because my parents were both professional musicians. And everything we did was for a greater cause, music. And our house was filled with music. But of course, that had its own responsibilities and stresses with it, because I can picture my parents. My father played violin, my mother played cello. And I can just see them sitting. We lived in a 2-room apartment, a basement apartment at 107th in Amsterdam. My view was feet walking by. And I'm surprised I didn't go into shoe sales, actually. But I can just see my parents, they just got married, and they're sitting at the table there, the one little table, and they say, we really need a trio. We should start a trio. I know, let's just make a pianist. So that's what happened. That's why I was born. I was born with a job, and they started me on piano when I was 2 years old. And I have to tell you that I really hated the piano. I hated it. My mother says I was a genius. I was the next Mozart and everything, as all mothers do. But I hated the piano, and I finally retired when I was 6 from the piano. And my parents, I thought everything was going to be all right. They were going to leave me alone. I could break my arms and whatever. And then they said, do you want to go to summer camp? Oh, summer camp. We lived in Manhattan, Even in those days, you couldn't really go out and play. And so they sent me to summer camp. And they said, right before I left, they said, we forgot to tell you, you might have to play the violin at summer camp. And so off I went, and I got to the summer camp, and the teacher met me. Oh, I also took the train by myself. I was 7 after all. It was 8 weeks sleepover summer camp. And I do want to say that my parents are wonderful people, and when they hear this story, they say, this doesn't sound like anything like your upbringing. So just a disclaimer. But I found out that I had to practice from 8 in the morning until 1. And fortunately, I had no sense of time because I was only 7, so it was all right. But the great thing about this was that I fell in love with playing the violin. It was the right instrument for me. And this experience made me realize later in life that there's an instrument for each of you, for every child. And if you haven't found it yet, it's just because you haven't found it yet. But the thing I loved the most was when I came back to New York, I guess I got pretty good in 8 weeks, and I was enrolled in Juilliard. And I played in the orchestra, and I got to sit inside this incredible sound. And I fell in love with playing in the orchestra. And I thought, life is going to be good now. I can be a musician. I'll fulfill my parents' dreams. I can play in the orchestra. And things went along pretty well for about a year. And then my parents got called into the director's office, the conductor and the dean of the Juilliard Pre-College. And they said, we're having some problems because a lot of people are complaining about somebody in the back of the second violins who's trying to lead the whole orchestra. So that was me. And, I thought, God, this classical music thing is for the birds. It's so stiff and so, it's just not fun. But my parents were always fun. I didn't understand why everybody else had to be so stuffy. And luckily, my father took me that same week to a concert with the New York Philharmonic. And this conductor came out, and he turned around and he started talking to the audience. And then he was jumping around like a crazy person. And I noticed no one seemed to be yelling at this guy. So I turned to my father and I said, I think that's what I'll do. I'll be the conductor because you can do whatever you want and nobody yells at you. And I never changed my mind. And that conductor was Leonard Bernstein. And he became my hero. In my room, I had a poster of the Beatles. That's how old I am. And Leonard Bernstein. And his was bigger. But, then I went and told my violin teacher, I have great news. I've decided on my career path. I was 9. And she said, oh, great. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to be a conductor. And she said, well, you're too young. And girls can't do that. And I thought, this was the first time I heard anything like this. Girls can't do that. It's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. And I went to my mom, and I was really upset, really, really upset. My mother was, on fire. I'm going to sue the school. I'm going to, she's crazy. And my father, who doesn't really, he couldn't get a word in edgewise anyway. When you're around my mother, you can't. So he's very understated. But next morning when I came down to breakfast, there was this long wooden box, which I still have. I opened it up. It was filled with batons. I know, it's sweet, isn't it? And it was this kind of encouragement that was so incredible for me to have. And also the fact that my parents both played instruments, and they would always play for free for me. This was very important because, becoming a conductor is a tricky thing. I mean, you can't practice your instrument. Violin, I could practice 8 hours a day, but unless you get 40 people to come over to your house every day, you can't practice conducting. You can't figure out how to do it. I mean, you can conduct the records, but believe me, it's nothing like that. And I'm sure you all do, but it's nothing like that. And so I had to figure out how to become a conductor. What can I do? And I started sort of training myself. As I'd play in the orchestra, I'd get the little scores so I could figure out what was going on. I tried to start to watch how conductors worked, how people interacted. But, I was dying to get my hands on an orchestra, but nobody would give me an opportunity. And as I got older, I'd try to get my friends to come over, and if I give you pizza, will you play? The best was a Mozart symphony I did. I had 2 saxophone players who were friends of mine, and a guitar. This was great. And then the regular rest. But, my friends tired of this. And every time I'd call, oh, God, here she is again. But I decided that, I tried to get into school. I graduated. I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and then I went to Juilliard, and I got my master's there. And I decided, okay, I'll go back to school and try to become a conductor. I couldn't get into school because you can't actually conduct. You can't get any experience conducting because nobody will give you experience because you haven't conducted. I mean, it's the worst catch-22 you can imagine. And so I decided, well, I don't know why I'm trying to go to school. Why don't I just make my own orchestra? And this is, I think, an important quality. When young people ask me, what's the best advice you can give? I think the best advice I can give is just don't give up. Just persevere. And, you pound and pound and pound at the front door. And, while no one's looking, just walk around the side and climb in the window. That's sort of what I did. And so I decided, okay, well, I'll start an orchestra. And I had to figure out, gosh, I had no idea how to start an orchestra. But I got all my friends together. I also, in my other life, I liked jazz, too. This was another thing that upset my violin teacher beyond belief. And so I decided, I had decided a few years earlier that I would start a swing band. So I had a string swing band. This was another crazy idea, but we had a blast together. And so I had all my friends from that play in my orchestra. And then I decided I needed to find someone who would help me form a board of directors, who would help mostly support it financially. And I remembered back that my swing band had played at a wedding, and this guy had paid us in cash. And I thought he would be a good candidate. So I phoned him up, and his name is Tomio Taki. And I phoned him, and I said, I'm sure you don't remember me. I remember you from the wedding, yes. And I said, can I take you for a drink? And anyway, I said to him, look, I know you don't know me at all, but I really need your help. The only thing in life I want to do is be a conductor, and I have to figure out how to do this. I need to create an orchestra. And this amazing man said, fine, I'll help you. And for 18 years, Mr. Taki supported my orchestra. We named it Concordia, and we played at Lincoln Center, and we did all kinds of wild things. And not only did I figure out how to conduct, but I figured out how to build a board of directors, how to market an orchestra, all these kinds of things. The skill set that I learned was beyond what I expected. But I also had an opportunity through that to try to break down the barriers in classical music. I created projects like a gospel version of Handel's Messiah. I mean, I did things that people who are, sort of so serious in classical music really hated. And I always liked that. There's something about that that's really fun, isn't there? Because it's just like and as conductors, we have all these managers. And, my managers always tell me things like, well, that's not a good career move, or, well, and I think to myself, I don't see any old ladies on the podiums anyway, so how can you know what's a good career move or not? So I always think that it's important to get advice, and then it's really important to ignore it sometimes. Anyway, so I started my own orchestra, but I was starting to despair in my late 20s. We played concerts. I had about 3 concerts a year, which I would prepare madly for. And I was starting to despair, though, that no one would ever give me a job. It was a little bit like a vanity press, that if I didn't create it myself, I wouldn't have an opportunity. And going back to this idea of persevering, I kept applying for a program at Tanglewood. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tanglewood Music Center in the Boston Symphony. It was the place to go as a young conductor. And so I kept applying. I applied 5 times. I was rejected 4 times. And on the 5th time, I got an audition. And shockingly, I got in. Not only did I get in, I got one of the elite positions as a conducting fellow. And, I understood by then, I was 30 years old. I understood that any opportunity I had was not to be squandered in any way. And I think this idea of maximizing, when you have fewer opportunities in life, I think you begin to understand how to maximize those opportunities. And that's become part of a philosophy for me, that every time you have a chance, don't just do the minimum, do the maximum you can. And it always grows into something else. So the most amazing thing happened at Tanglewood, because I just was so prepared. Every time I got a piece, I stayed up all night. Everybody else was out drinking. I was studying. I'm a little dull on that front now. But anyway, I did use the opportunity. And they called me in and they said, well, we've decided that you will conduct the concert with Leonard Bernstein. And so, this was probably the happiest day of my life and I was only worried that I might have a heart attack and miss it. So I would lie in the bed at night thinking, oh, please don't die, please don't die. But it was incredible, and he took me under his wing. He gave me a lesson, 2 hours lesson, and it was amazing to me to have a hero exceed my expectations. Not only to have a hero, but then to meet the hero and have this person exceed my expectations. But it wasn't just about music, and we became very close, and I worked with him until he died 3 years later. But it was also about other things. I watched him use his position to stand up for things he believed in. And that, to me, was a new model of leadership, and something that I really, really, really admired. Even if I disagreed with him, I felt strongly about this. And from that opportunity at Tanglewood, I was able then to get a music directorship. My first music directorship was in Eugene, Oregon. I'd never really left Manhattan, and then it was very dark after you leave Manhattan and there are no lights. But Eugene, Oregon, a small community where I tried to, again, maximize this incredible opportunity. And I learned about growth. I always assumed that growth was about, more concerts, making something bigger. But it's not. It's about depth of experience often. And I learned so many things in Eugene, which I carried forward. I was very, very proud in 2002 to become the first woman to lead a British orchestra. And I think there was one line about it in the press, and then it was over. They know they got the Queen, they had the, Prime Minister, everything. They know this women leadership thing, I think. Also, I was a foreigner. I think that helped. And then in 2005, I was named music director of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and there was a lot more than one line. There was a huge, huge uproar when I was named. And I don't know to this day if it had anything to do with my being a woman, probably, but not overtly. The musicians they said they weren't listened to, they weren't considered, and when my appointment was made, on and on. It was possibly the worst experience of my life, the day that should have been the greatest experience. When my picture was on, not the art section, which I was accustomed to, of the Washington Post, but the front page. And the caption read, musicians balk at appointment of music director. It was really, I thought, I can't believe this after everything I've worked so hard for. And I got a lot of advice then. Everyone said, you better run as far as you can from these crazy people. Get out of there. And what were my choices? I could run, or I could stay and be abused. Neither was a good. I thought, what are the women going to say when, what happened to that woman that was appointed to the Baltimore Symphony? Oh, I thought, I can't do that. I didn't have a good choice. I had to stay. But how could I turn this around? It's fascinating because in some ways, this nightmare was liberating. I didn't have to try to make people like me because they hated me. So what was the point? I didn't waste any energy. It was almost like you didn't have to go through that whole honeymoon thing, where and you're trying to make everybody feel comfortable. I didn't care. My only goal was to be successful for them. And I need the musicians, though, as you can see. As a conductor, I don't even make any noise. I groan a little bit, but I don't, nothing, no music. Without these 100 people and their generosity and their willingness to play for me. I'm nothing. So I decided that I would go and talk to the musicians. They didn't know I was coming. I called a colleague of mine and said, can I have 10 minutes of your rehearsal time? And I walked in. Really, you should have been there. They're all like, oh. And I said to them, look, I don't know if I can ever get over this, what happened, honestly. But you don't know me, and you don't know what I can do for you. And I laid out my plan for them in 7 minutes. And, they had $16 million in debt. They had 60% attendance. They hadn't made a recording in 10 years. All of these things. And I said, I can help you with all of these issues. And I said, but I can't do it, and I won't sign the contract unless I know you're with me. And I didn't let any management into this meeting. And before I left the stage, and I said, why don't you talk about it? And before I left the stage, they called me back, and the head of the committee said, you have our support. I didn't feel like rah, rah, rah or anything like that. But I realized that going into this situation, every decision I made, every move I made, I had to really think it through. And I had to communicate. The musicians were unhappy. They were dissatisfied. This was a cathartic moment for them to make a statement. And there was something wrong, something ill in the system at the Baltimore Symphony. And right before I took over, this MacArthur grant came from the sky, which was an incredible boost and encouragement. But I also was invited to the World Economic Forum at Davos. God, I was like, I don't know why, but I'll go. It sounds like a good thing to do, and I like Switzerland. So I had the opportunity there. They put me on a panel with top CEOs, and the topic was non-financial incentives for employees. And I thought, what am I doing here on this panel? But it was very interesting. This triggered something for me because I realized that the thing you may not know is orchestral musicians, they rank, I think, probably near the bottom in terms of dissatisfaction with their workplace because they have been groomed from a young age to be the center, and then they have to let go and sublimate their ego to the greater good of often conductors who may not know what they're doing. It's a very, very difficult existence. And I thought about why they went into music. Not one musician I know went into music to make a lot of money. Never. That's never the motivation, and you never do. But they went into it because they couldn't help it. As kids, there was something that drew them, like it drew me in. And so I thought a lot about this, and I went to the musicians. And this is another thing. I've always tried to be transparent with them and speak to them as a group instead of through committees and all these things. I mean, we don't have group therapy by any means, but every few months I'll take 5 minutes from a rehearsal and talk to them. And I said to them, okay, I have an idea. And, of course, they love me already. And I said, I think we should all mentor a child in the neighborhood. And it's, Baltimore's a tough place. And so we'll have 90 mini-me's, okay? We'll all mentor a kid. And they, it was meant. And I said, I want 100% participation, and also there'll be no compensation. So that went over well, as you can imagine. And we started a huge discussion about this idea and why it wouldn't work. And, I really listened to them. I listened to their issues. They were worried, where would they park in that neighborhood? I mean, you can't imagine what they were worried about. But they had valid concerns also. And for the next year, I listened to what was wrong with it, how we could create it. And I brought partners in. I think as women in leadership positions, we're willing to collaborate. I think that's a key element in terms of creative leadership is how can you also bring more people on board and maximize their strengths as well. And I got the police department on board. I got the public school system on board, many, many after-school programs. And I went back, and the musicians were also worried that that their salaries somehow would be diminished because we'd have to raise money from other sources for this program. So I went back to the musicians about a year later, and I said, I have incredible news for you. And they looked at me with their usual excitement. And I said, here is your program. And, you know, it was really interesting. What can you say when someone listens to every single concern you have and tries to incorporate it? So I went through the whole thing. And then, of course, well, what about the fundraising? And I said, well, you know, I got all this money suddenly from MacArthur, and I'll fund it. And so that sort of ended that as well. And so we started this program with 30 kids, after-school program. And today we have 600 kids, 4 years later. And it's called Orchids. And I have a short little video I thought I'd show you.
Hardly any place needs that change more than West Baltimore, where poverty, drugs, and shootings are endemic, where since last fall, young children carrying musical instruments to school has been a common sight.
Saxophone? All right.
About 150 pre-K to third graders at Lockerman Bundy Elementary School belong to a new privately funded music program started by Marin Alsop, the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. Called Orchestra Kids, or Orchids for short, it's another example of the system taking root in America.
It's all about exposure at a very, very young age. There's so many skill sets that you need. Coordination, you have to develop your ear, you have to develop your brain. And just like learning a foreign language, the younger you start, the more fluent you become.
And that's what you're trying to do with Orchids.
You know, it's sort of a work in progress.
Work really kicked off last October when a truck pulled up at the school carrying $50,000 worth of musical instruments. Enough for an orchestra, and enough to make these kids think it was Christmas.
You got a big one.
Parents are parents. When you offer someone's child an opportunity to better themselves, I mean,
People jump at it, huh?
They jump at it.
So you want to show your dad what you can do? Let's come on in here.
We saw an example of that when Alsop and Dan Trahey, who runs Orchids, ran into tuba player Miguel Ware. He's 5.
All right. All we need from you guys is a commitment that he'll be here.
Parents have to sign a contract promising that kids like Miguel will be there, get good grades, and take care of their instruments. When the regular school day ends at 3:15, the kids start making music. If they stick with the program, they'll be doing it all the way from kindergarten to the 5th grade. The staff of about 15 teachers, some of them musicians from the Baltimore Symphony, work with the kids. Deshane Parker, a single mother with 3 children in the program, says they love it.
They want to come to school every day. They don't want to miss a day from the program. And now that they're bringing their instruments home, it's just teaching them how to be, you know, better children and responsible.
And you play the cello. We saw that yesterday.
Cello. Yes, cello.
What is it about the cello that you like?
That you can play like different sounds on different strings, and you can like make it sound different. And you can play open notes and harmonics.
You know a lot about music, don't you?
Yes.
And the kids in Baltimore are already picking up the baton which could one day take them someplace like this.
So that's already a couple years ago. I have some orchids now who are this incredibly tall. But I'm happy to say that after 5 years with the Baltimore Symphony, I think we're now a different kind of organization. We're really one of the leaders in role models for the 21st century orchestra. We don't exist in an ivory tower anymore. It's a destination point for our community. We have our ticket sales are way up. We retired our debt. We operate with a balanced budget these days. We've made 6 recordings so far in these years. And, I think the thing that matters the most to me, though, is that the musicians seem to be engaged in a new way. We have a program that I think I'll talk about a little bit with Dean called Rusty Musicians, where I decided to invite people who haven't played instruments or just in a non-professional capacity to play with our orchestra. And the musicians, of course, I explained my idea to them, and they said, the usual. And then I said, well, let's just see if there's any interest. And we put it out online, and in 24 hours we had 400 people sign up. And this has morphed, though, into a program that has really connected the musicians to the community in a new way, because this is what they actually needed. This is what I was trying to achieve through Orchids, but I didn't quite with my musicians, but I have with this program. They have professionals, people that they can relate to, sitting next to them saying, I wish I could be you. I always wanted to be you, but I couldn't make that work. And we just did a Rusty evening this week, and we had 5 people fly in from different states just to play for 40 minutes with the orchestra. But I can talk more about that too. And to me, though, the Orchids program, I don't expect these kids to become professional musicians. If they do, it's great. But this is a program really about possibility. And to me, I'm hoping that 20 years down the way, when I go to the doctor in Baltimore, she'll say, oh, aren't you Miss Marin? I was an orchid. That's my goal, is to try to make a difference in terms of possibility, because that's what my parents gave me, this idea of a world filled with possibility. So thank you very much for having me, and I think we're going to do some question and answer, right? Thank you. I'm sorry I went long.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Sure.
Whew. Now you can see why I'm such a fan.
Oh, thank you.
That was wonderful. It was really, really, it was incredible to see not just the kind of narrative and arc of your life, but also how there were just these different barriers, but you used them as doors for walking through.
Thank you.
I'm someone who's taught leadership for a decade before I was a dean, and I've thought some about it. One of the funny things about becoming a dean, though, is you realize that being a professor who teaches leadership is nothing like actually running an organization, and I've never run an organization before. That's another story. But for you, I'm really struck by the fact that it sounds like from a very young age you kind of went on this entrepreneurial approach to things and actually figured out what it was to be an entrepreneur and how to run an organization. How old were you when you actually started that? I think that's something that's intrinsic to who I am. Just in terms of leadership, I'm not a very athletic person. I mean, I'm not gifted athletically, but I always ended up being captain of the team. You know what I mean? Because I like, and maybe for those who are psychiatrists here tonight, maybe being an only child and always wanting to create an extended family was part of it. But I also had parents who, besides musicians, they're people who live life with the sense of anything's possible. My father built houses, they collected antiques, they started an antique store. My mother decided she would become a potter. She made all my dishes. You know what I mean? It's sort of like this free-form existence. And having that as a model, I think, really gave me the freedom to say, oh, yeah, I want to do that. Let me see. I'll make it. That's how they live life. And so that happened from an early age for me. So it was almost since the minute you were given the baton and you were told that this was an opportunity for you. But then you went through this process of actually building an organization,
right.
Which took you through up until, I guess, the period when you had the opportunity in Boston. Is that right?
Yeah, even beyond that, I started Concordia with Mr. Taki in 1984, and we disbanded 18 years later, so it was quite a long period. I should also say, I didn't get to it, but I think that we, as privileged women in the role of leadership, have a happy obligation to figure out how to make it easier for the next generations, because they'll have other obstacles. And I think one of the things about the conducting field, is that I worry that if I'm the only woman that people see, that it becomes attached to me. I think, as I was saying, with seeing the news anchors change and that kind of thing, you need to see a lot more women in those roles, and a lot of varied women, and women that are great at it and women that aren't so great at it. It can't be so, that if you one misstep, that no other women can do it. So in 2002, I started a fellowship for young women conductors. And I decided to, I think it's also very important to say thank you to people who have helped you. And my fellowship is called the Taki, for Mr. Taki Concordia, which was our orchestra conducting fellowship. And we have our 7th winner now, who's a Brazilian woman. And she's my assistant in Baltimore. But 3 of the 7 are American music directors now, 3 women.
Wow.
So I think it's important to I'm sorry, I don't even remember your question, but
it's all right. It fits perfectly with what Linda and I are trying to do as well, and just even if in some small way, just to contribute to this issue and this problem.
Right.
It sounds like it's an interesting thing, though, for people in your positions, because I wouldn't call it an extra burden, but you have an extra sense of responsibility that other people in these positions wouldn't necessarily have. Which
right.
I don't know. Does that feel like a burden or something?
No, I mean, it feels like I think a gift in a way, because I want to make it easier, and I think that mentoring young people it's an inspiration. I think not just for the young person, but even more so, I think, for me. And so it feels like a happy obligation in a way. And seeing people, I think for me, seeing people empowered is very satisfying.
Yeah. And it sounds like you have that with respect to the issues of gender inequality in your job, but you've also translated that into the kind of work that you're doing with disadvantaged kids in Baltimore. But it sounds like also with just drawing in other groups of people. Tell us a little more about the Rusty musicians.
Oh, the Rusty musicians?
It's just,
well, that is really... That was, as I said, the first turnout was amazing. And so then the musicians said to me, after they said, when I suggested the idea, one of my musicians said, "Oh yeah, and tomorrow I'm going to perform brain surgery." So I said, if you think what we do is comparable to brain surgery, you need to get a new job. It's interesting because they were saying, well, how will we decide? Because at the end we had 600 people sign up for our first offering. And then they said, well, how will we select who will play with us? And I said, I don't think you get it. We're not going to select. They're all going to play with us. And I said, but I want each of them to be able to be close enough to one of you. So we expanded it to 8 hours. And I conducted all 8 hours. They didn't play all 8 hours, of course, because they're delicate. But no, I do love them. And I never thought I would say that about the Baltimore Symphony musicians. But we did 8 hours, and we had a holding pen of 80 Rusties waiting. And then they would come on, and then we'd turn over. And it was fascinating to watch, because the first time, it was very stiff. The musicians were very stiff. And gradually, by the third group, the musicians were meeting people they hadn't seen since child. Oh, didn't we go to school together? Or, and then they would be, hey, Marin, take our picture. You know what I mean? So they took over. And then we started talking further about it. I said, listen, why don't we evolve it into something more, a deeper experience for the people that really want to. So we started a fantasy camp now. And in the summer for a week, people can enroll. And it's wall-to-wall, with the BSO coaching, lessons, everything. I mean, it's intense. I conduct the concert, and we do a concert at the end. And we just finished our third year in June, and we have 100 participants. And it's incredible. And the musicians own it. They really have taken it over.
So I don't want to overanalyze this from a business perspective, so tell me if I'm off base. But it sounds like one of the amazing things that you've done. So the building of these kind of programs also follows the arc of, you getting the organization financially healthy and, retiring the debt and all of those things. But in some sense, what you've done is you've knitted together the institutional fabric of civic life. So the musicians feel like they're with the community, and the community feels like they own
Right.
some piece of it.
Right.
Is that?
That's the idea. I think for me, especially coming up through classical music, seeing how it had become the perception anyway, and still is to a certain degree an extraordinarily elitist experience. And I realized that was going to be the death of the institution. And certainly that's not how it started. I mean, symphony started by people, everyday people, wanting to play together, wanting to get together and socialize. And, concerts were a pretty raucous affair where people, they liked a melody. I like that tune. They'd yell out and things like that. I mean, not that I'm advocating that, but, so we've gotten so far away from that. How do we create not a fringe? So classical music isn't looked at as a fringe, but rather something on the fringe, but something that's really essential and vital and part of the community. And that was the goal.
And that's in some ways what your off-the-cuff events do. I mean, I realize for myself, being somebody who doesn't understand classical music that well, those events make me feel I understand the context now. And, the maestro had the goodwill to tell me exactly what's going on and what's happening in this, and it just feels like very close in some ways. It's
exciting. I do a series now called. I like to speak a little bit as you can tell, at the concerts, and I had been just introducing new pieces, contemporary music, which people seem to be terrified of usually, and then audience members said, "Well, why don't you talk about the old pieces too?" And so I started a series called Off the Cuff. And we tear a piece. We just did Beethoven Fifth that you came to, right? Taking the piece apart, and I dissected it, and the orchestra used the orchestra to do examples and show where things came from, and then we put it back together and play the piece. And it's become very popular. We're actually going to expand that series, and for me, it's a lot of fun. And I think in this day and age, people, first of all, a lot of people don't have time to learn music when they're young anymore, but also people want more information, and to me, context is what makes it really interesting.
And it's amazing for anybody who hasn't seen this. I highly recommend it because it really does create this dynamic in which, for the first time, I mean, I can say for the first time when I've seen your things that I was like truly sad when the concert was over. I wanted more.
The first time you were truly sad. Okay.
I mean, it's when you're.
No, but when you're in you have the inside track, right? It's a different kind of experience.
Completely different experience. Yeah. It's really wonderful. So this is a little bit of a shifting gears because I'm just very curious here again about the interesting dance that a leader does between kind of the strategic vision and understanding, whether it's understanding how to relate to the community or understanding what is putting your industry in peril. But then at the same time, you're working within an organization, and you have to deal with those moments when your people are angry or they're rejecting the new leader and there's like an organizational culture thing that you very much have to be in and of them. How do you do that balance? How do you think about that?
I think it's particularly challenging in the role of the maestro. There's an expectation. Also, there's a mythology about being a maestro that is hard to manage. There's a lot of baggage with this. And I agree. When I think of a maestro, I don't think of me. I think of, an elderly gentleman with an accent, and like Lenny with an ascot. That's who I think of. That's who comes to mind. I think people still have an archetypal image that's hard to battle against. Also, the maestro's supposed to just do the music, just
right.
conduct and stop having ideas. That is a hard place for me to be in a lot of times. And it's exhausting, I realize, for the people that I work with. But, to be a conductor, the one thing you have to do, and I think to be a great leader, the one thing you have to do is to have a willingness to be self-aware and a willingness to understand your flaws and also a sense of humor about your flaws. You have to give yourself a break. But I understand that I am a lot of work. And I try to reference that now and then for people, especially when I'm on to the 10th idea and why haven't you done anything yet, people? I understand. So for me, I think in dealing with the musicians, it's important to understand where they're coming from, really try to put yourself in their place. I played in orchestra for many years, so that helps. But not only that, also give them a way out and show a vision. I think if you have a vision and you're enthusiastic and you also are receptive, just because I listen to you doesn't mean I'm going to do what you say. They have to that's sometimes a problem. Mm-hmm. People think that if they have a moment to have input, that you'll do what they say. That doesn't necessarily mean that. It's been a big learning curve for them in terms of that. But I try when possible to incorporate ideas. And I also think that, and this is from becoming a parent, I think that when you feel someone's done a good job, it's important to say it.
Right.
That's not something I'm accustomed to. But with a child, it's really important. And I try to, I can't bring myself to do it when it isn't true. So I think authenticity is probably important too.
Yeah, there's this whole movement in business school teaching right now called authentic leadership, and it's basically about this notion of really getting students to step outside of themselves, and instead of just thinking about vision and strategy, to really just think about introspection. And so is there given that, was there a moment in the time when you took over as the director at BSO where you felt like you had some kind of really humbling moment in which you really needed to take a step back and say, okay, I've learned something different now, and or was it sort of more an organic process?
I think it was more of an organic process. I'm not sure. I think I was very guarded for a while, because I felt that these people, probably unintentionally, but still almost ruined me overnight. Uh-huh. So it was for me it was a delicate line to tread. But I think when we first performed our first year at Carnegie Hall, and we had the rehearsal, and we had a rehearsal. I prepared them well. They were ready to go, and we rehearsed for we had an hour set aside in our contract, and we rehearsed for about 40 minutes, and I said, I think it'll be great. I hope you have a great time. Let's have fun. And they all just sat there staring at me, sort of dumbfounded. And then I didn't know what was going on at all. And then later someone said, well, don't you know, all of our previous conductors, they would lose their tempers and freak out when we were going to play in Carnegie Hall. It was a nightmare for all of us. It's the first time we had a good time. And I realized maybe that's really the most important thing, is people just enjoying life together.
What's the future, not just for you and the BSO, but for classical music? Or is this a...
Yeah, that's always it's a cyclical question about classical music, whether it's relevant, whether it's going to die. I don't know. Do you think art is going to die? That would be very sad. I think when the human race dies, perhaps, or when we extinguish ourselves. But I don't know. It's interesting to look. As I was sharing with you, I was recently appointed music director in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, which the largest orchestra in South America, and so I commute back and forth. And to see what's happening in South America around classical music is beyond belief. I mean, it's so exciting. You heard reference the system in Venezuela. They have a system of orchestra playing for young kids. They've reached over 800,000 kids, and the new music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Gustavo Dudamel, came through that program. And so, he sold more recordings in Venezuela than Madonna. And when I go, and also in Brazil, there are these amazing programs that embrace these youngsters. And I'm like a rock star there. It's a different, there's something happening in this emerging economy of South America that is giving new life. And I think we'll just see the shift from Europe, from North America, more towards South America, China also.
That's wonderful. Well, I don't want to hog the questioning, and so if you would do us the honor of taking 10 more minutes for questions from the audience. Are there any questions here? Yes, over here, and please speak up.
My name's Hannah, and I'm from the Arts and Culture cohort of our Women's Leadership program here, so this is really relevant to what we're studying. I just wanted to say thank you for all you're doing with children and all the programs you have. I'm actually from Baltimore, and seeing all these pictures of my home BSO is making me really nostalgic because I kind of grew up there. My mom would take me there every month or two, and I've been to so many of
that's great.
performances. So I've seen you conduct a lot, and when I was younger, I went to a lot of the children's programs, and that's kind of how I got into music because I'm sure you're familiar with the days where they would have all the instruments out, like in the lobbies.
Right, and you could try them.
And that's how I got into playing, and now I'm very, very involved in like classical guitar from doing that. And I just wanted to know a little bit about if you have any involvement in the children's programs, like at the Meyerhoff, not just outside in the community.
Sure. So the question, I don't know if everybody heard, if I have personal involvement in the programs for kids. I'm getting more and more involved in that now that Orchids has its own profile and is doing so well. I think that's an incredible opportunity, as we can see from your experience. And so I place a lot of importance. I mean, my goal would be to do these concerts, but do them for free. So that price doesn't become a barrier so that every single person could come. So I'd like to do them every week, but of course, they said, can't you just go and conduct and be quiet? So, but nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Giselle Becker. I conduct the choir here at GW, and yet we all kind of do the music of dead white guys.
Yeah.
Is there any answer to that? Or do we try to make the dead white guy music relevant to people who aren't dead white guys?
This was one of the reasons that led me to my initial proposal to the BSO musicians. So I look at our orchestra, and it doesn't reflect the diversity of the community at all. I have 2 African-American musicians in an orchestra of 80 people in Baltimore. I mean, it doesn't really work. And why is that? It's because in order to play a musical instrument at the level of the Baltimore Symphony, which is at the top level, you have to start when you're very, very young. And so that's part of the goal with the Orchids, is getting the kids this opportunity from a young enough age. And that, I believe that will also lead to more diversity in terms of composers. There are a couple of African-American composers. James Lee is one that comes to mind, and we commissioned a work that he wrote for us based on Harriet Tubman's life. So that's been interesting to work with James. But again, I think it's because so many economically challenged kids haven't had the same opportunities. I mean, but we could talk about education now, too. I mean, that's a whole other... Once I'm done conducting, I want to fix healthcare and education in America. So I really have a lot of work to do, I think. But we'll see what happens. I wouldn't be surprised if several of these Orchids end up going toward composition because they have this exposure early.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
A couple more. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Kate Boardman. I'm the conductor of GW's pet band. I was wondering, programs like SSAMA that you see in Latin
Yeah, that's a great question about El Sistema in America. I don't know. It's been very interesting because there's a lot of talk about starting all kinds of El Sistema-like programs, but it's so typical of what we do in America is we really we have to measure everything. I think that's one of the challenges and one of the barriers is so much measuring. You become obsessed with measuring what you could do or studying what you can do instead of just doing it. I think the success about El Sistema is that they just did it. They don't really have any resources to start. It's one guy just doing it. And he was an economist, I don't know if he still is an economist and a musician. And I worry that every constituency wants to measure in its own way. Everything seems to become very politicized. And so I worry in America that a national system wouldn't work or wouldn't be able to happen. Who knows? Maybe orchids could become the national system. I'll happily give the tools to whoever wants them. I think that's another thing. Generosity is important, to share what you've learned and to make it available to people without it having to cost them too much money. But we'll see.
And I think that's a brilliant point to end on. But before I let you go, I just want to one more time, I want to thank Linda again and our partners at the IWF and Lily Richardella. I don't know if Lily's here. But even beyond that, I have to just say, it always is so clear to me with events like this that these things don't happen without the tireless work of people that are behind the scenes, and so many of them are in the audience today. Sarah Kellogg is here, Christine Patton, David Slocum, Dustin. I could just go on and on. But one person that I just have to embarrass, and I don't even know if she's still around the corner because she always just disappears and fades in the background, but Kirsten Steich is just a tireless worker for the good of the school, and she really helped put this event on. And so I want to just thank all of you for all the work that you've done. And most of all, I want to thank you. This has been such a blast for me. The maestro is going to hang out for a little bit, and we have some CDs.
I dragged up a box of CDs if anybody wants them.
I heard you'll sign them.
Yeah.
And we have some cocktails and hors d'oeuvres on the second floor, and please join us. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.